Our first guest has been the nanny and governess of such prominent people as Prince and Princess Michael of Kent and author Danielle Steel, and is also the author of an inspirational memoir, The Last Tear. May I introduce to you Jean Alice Rowcliffe. Jean, you have an amazing story to tell. Where does it start?
It starts in London, Ontario, where I was born in 1955. And I, at 12 years old, made a list of everything I wanted to do in my life. And a couple of those things were to work for the Queen and train to be a nanny and travel the world. So I've managed to do a lot of those.
Why would somebody say at that young age that they wanted to work for the Queen?
I have no idea.
Okay, good.
It was just sounded like a good idea at the time.
So how did you get the job?
Well, it's quite a long story, more than we have time for, but I started writing. In those days we wrote letters. We didn't have the internet, of course, so I wrote to the Canadian High Commissioner in Ottawa, and he put me in touch with the Master of the Household in Buckingham Palace, and we just sort of went from there. And I'm not sure if this is
working fine. It's fine.
And then when I finished high school, I went over to England and had an interview and got a job, and so I moved into Buckingham Palace and started my employment as a young woman there.
And what was your first day like?
Pretty crazy, because I obviously it was a dream for me to be in England. I'd always wanted to be there, so it was pretty magical, and I loved every moment of it. But I also learned very quickly how structured and rarefied that world was.
And so who did you meet? Can you name drop all the people you met?
Well, that position was considered, quote, downstairs. So I did meet the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. The lesser, the younger members of the royal family would wander through the household, of course. We traveled to the other royal residences, Windsor Castle, Hollywood House, and Balmoral. So those were much smaller homes, and you would see them there. But then it wasn't until I became a nanny that I then was elevated to a much higher standing, and that's when I would meet the family more personally.
And as a nanny, were you the only nanny?
Yes, I trained, after I left Buckingham Palace, I traveled through Europe for many months, and then decided I really wanted to get that training at Norlin. And that's the oldest college in the world for training nursery nursing, and this is the uniform that you see
for Norlin
here.
Or for the nurses?
For the Norlin nannies. And in fact, William and Kate have a Norlin nanny now, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. So you sometimes see photos of their nanny wearing this uniform. But that's the uniform that I would wear when I was working.
Daily?
Daily, yes. And when I came to America to work then, I wore it as well, initially. But then we found in America I stood out too much, and it was seen as a threat for kidnapping, so I would change and wear my own clothes. But anyway.
What was the most difficult thing about being a nanny to the royal family?
It was full charge. It was sole charge, as it was called. So the parents would visit the children during the day, and that's how it was in very formal households, and it still is to this day. So it's the nanny's responsibility to be mother, father, everything for those children. And you live in a separate area of the house, the nursery floor. If any of you watched Downton Abbey or Remains of the Day, those are very close to the sort of life that I lived, where it's quite rarefied. Nanny runs the show, children and her live separately to the family, and you visit throughout the course of the day or the week.
So you develop a very close relationship
very
with the children.
Very strong bonds, very strong. In fact, Freddie and Ella, who were my first charges, are still very close to me. And Freddie was actually godfather to my son James.
When it comes time to leave, then how is it possible?
It's difficult. It's very difficult. I left because I wanted to travel and see more of the world, and they understood that. But we were very lucky that we stayed close friends, and still we remain very close to this day. In fact, often when I'm in London, I stay at Kensington Palace in the nursery. They've made that available for me, even though no one's
Can
there.
I go with you next time?
Sure.
Great.
We just
Can I
have
go
to
with
get
her?
a security pass. But no,
but
it's lovely to stay friends because you invest a lot of heart in this type of work, and it's very different because you are, as again, sole charge. So you're making a lot of choice and responsibility rests on you. So you do forge a strong bond.
Can you relate any amusing moments that happened to you while you were there?
Oh, there's many. I always remember Freddie didn't like to eat fruit, and I had a way that if you cut an apple down the center and cut it in half, it becomes a star. So I would tell him that he could do magic, and if he said abracadabra, cut this, if he got the star, then he would have to eat that side of the apple. So sure enough, that was the way to get him to eat it. Well, once we were at a very formal tea party at the Duke of Wellington's at Apsley House, and there were, you know, the big polished table and all the nannies and the children, and Freddie wanted, I remember, some chocolate biscuits on the table, and I said, oh, what's the magic word? Hoping he would say, please may I have, and he said abracadabra. And of course, all these old nannies, this younger generation of women, they were not happy with me, but still.
I'm sure that having, you know, work for the type of people you work for, there are people who are always trying to pull information out of you. How do you deal with people who are trying to say, you know, can you tell me something that...
Yeah, I have to be, you know, I'm discreet and loyal, and sometimes I say I can't tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, when I decided to leave England and move to America, I did a lot of interviewing for different jobs, and one of them was with the Trumps, which I happily turned down, and that's another story. But there were other people that I would interview, and one fellow in his New York office asked me what I thought Prince Michael was worth. And I was so horrified that that would even be asked, and I told him so. Mm-hmm. And I just said, you know, that is such an inappropriate question. So, you know, you get pretty good at setting boundaries.
How have I done so far?
Very good,
okay,
Sean.
Good.
Very good.
I'm not going to ask you how much anybody does.
No. But I always thought that was so cheeky. But
so how did you get from being an employee of the royal family to getting a job with Danielle Steel?
Well, I had wanted to travel, and so when I left the Kents and I interviewed with all these various families, Danielle Steel was one of the clients that was looking for a Norlander, and so...
A what?
A Norlander, the nanny.
Oh, the nanny,
Norlin.
okay, got it.
They wanted the Norlin nanny. So I interviewed with her and flew to San Francisco, and we got on well, and so I went to work for Danielle, and we became very good friends as well. And so her family I still remain close to.
Right. So you can pick up the phone and phone her like that.
Mm-hmm. Or emails. Nobody phones anymore.
Nobody phones anymore, right? Sorry.
You type, you text, you do all this craziness.
Now, do you think that in one of her books you may have...
Oh, I wouldn't know. I'm sure we were all fodder for something.
Right.
But she's a good friend. Yeah.
Any other recognizable names of employers that you had that you could tell us?
Arianna Huffington, I was hired for her babies to get them to go through the night, work on their sleep patterns. That was when she was in Southern California, married to Michael at the time.
Now, she has a whole thing about how everybody needs sleep. Did she get that from you?
I don't know. I'd have to ask her.
Because she's going around lecturing about how everybody needs sleep. And
this goes back many years now.
So you sound a bit like sort of like a Mary Poppins.
A lot of people have called me that over the years. Yeah.
And you're writing a book about?
I'm working on different books. I've got a number of children's books that I've been working on, and I, of course, wrote the book about my son, sadly, who died of cancer 8 years ago, and I'm doing a follow-up to that book now to talk about what I've learned about grief and moving forward. I like working with the bereaved and would like to do more of that work.
And in a very short time, what did you learn about dealing with grief?
It's very personal. There's no right or wrong way to walk the path, and you really need friends with you who will just sit with you. Those who said, I don't know what to say, were the ones that really affected me the most, instead of trying to fill up the empty space with a solution. I realize there is no solution to grief. You just have to walk forward, and it learns to become your companion.
And what brought you to St. Mary's?
Peace and harmony, all the good things, right? I don't know how, it was one of those flukes where I thought I need to put down a base, and this house on Robinson became available, and it was just a perfect spot, and I walked in the door and I knew that it was mine.
Wonderful.
So I'm home.
Okay, great. And so you've done the book about Danielle. Sorry,
James.
James.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What a Danielle Steel I'm thinking of.
Yeah,
But I shared a quote of his. Could you say the quote that I shared about the wind chime?
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
James was quite a little Buddha, and when he was in the 3rd grade, he had to do a haiku. And so the one that he wrote was, "Be the wind chime, let the storm blow through you, turn storm into song."
And I think that's marvelous.
So,
Okay, thank you for coming on our show. It's been great.
Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you.